Some marriages begin with love. This one began with a risk that could have ruined 2 lives. West Texas, October 1944. The courthouse in Red Hollow sat alone at the edge of Main Street like it had been waiting for something heavy to happen. Its white wooden walls had faded under 20 years of sun, and the bell in its narrow tower hadn't rung since the county fair in the spring. By 8 o'clock that Thursday night, every light inside was supposed to be off. But one room still glowed amber against the dark. Sheriff Thomas Walker stood at the front of the county clerk's office with his hat in both hands, his badge catching the yellow light from the oil lamp beside him. At 38, Walker had the face of a man who had seen too much weather and too much war to be surprised by either. 6'2", broad in the shoulders, boots dusted with dry Texas dirt, he looked like the kind of man who belonged to rules. The kind who enforced them. Tonight, he was about to break one. Across from him stood Elise Hartmann, 26 years old, a German prisoner of war brought to Texas 3 weeks earlier under military labor assignment. Her prison-issued gray dress hung neatly against her frame, clean but worn thin at the sleeves. Her blonde hair was pinned back tightly, practical, disciplined. She stood perfectly still, hands folded in front of her, her eyes fixed on the wooden floorboards as if looking up might make the moment less real. Between them stood Reverend Samuel Price, 61, spectacles low on his nose, Bible open but untouched. Beside him, County Clerk Martha Green adjusted her glasses and looked at the marriage papers for the 3rd time, like maybe the ink would rearrange itself into something less impossible. "Thomas," she whispered, "you understand what this means?" Walker nodded once. He understood. A county sheriff marrying an enemy national. A German prisoner. In wartime. There were regulations for everything in 1944. And this sat outside all of them. Elise finally lifted her eyes toward him. They were pale blue, steady, but tired in a way youth shouldn't allow. 3 weeks ago, she had arrived in Red Hollow in the back of an army truck with 12 other German women prisoners. Captured in France. Processed in Virginia. Sent to Texas to work cotton fields and canning sheds while American men fought overseas. Walker had signed the intake papers himself. Prisoner number 74921. Elise Hartmann. Former field nurse. No known family remaining in Germany. No disciplinary concerns. At the time, she had been just another file. Another name in a war full of names. But war had a way of moving strange pieces into strange places. Reverend Price cleared his throat and looked toward the window. Outside, the town was asleep. Quiet. Empty. But Walker knew quiet didn't last. Secrets moved fast in small Texas towns. Faster than trains. Faster than army mail. Faster than forgiveness. He slipped a plain silver band from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. Nothing fancy. Just silver. Bought that afternoon from Miller's General Store for $12.50. Practical. Honest. Like the decision itself. Elise stared at the ring for a long moment, her breath catching just slightly. Not fear. Not doubt. Something heavier. Something that looked like the moment before stepping off a ledge and trusting there would be ground beneath you. Walker looked at her and said the words low enough that only she could hear them. "Once we do this, there's no going back." She answered in careful English, her accent still carrying traces of another world. "There was no going back for me long before tonight." And somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, under the wide black Texas sky, an army sedan rolled down the empty highway toward Red Hollow, its headlights cutting through dust, carrying 2 men from Army intelligence and a file with Sheriff Thomas Walker's name already inside. 3 weeks earlier, the road into Red Hollow baked under a September sun so hot the air above it shimmered like water. The army truck rolled through town at 20 miles an hour, its tires pushing up pale dust that drifted over storefront windows and porch rails. People stopped what they were doing to watch. Men leaned against fence posts. Women stood in doorways holding dish towels or grocery sacks. Children stared from behind wagon wheels. News traveled fast in West Texas, and by noon everybody knew the army was bringing in German prisoners. Sheriff Thomas Walker stood outside the county office with his thumbs hooked into his belt, hat low over his brow, watching the truck approach. He had been given the paperwork 2 days earlier. 12 female prisoners of war. Agricultural labor assignment. Temporary placement. Federal supervision. He had read the file twice and still found it strange. Women. Not soldiers exactly, but caught in the machinery of war all the same. The truck stopped in front of the processing barn behind the courthouse. The engine clicked as it cooled. A young corporal jumped down first, sweat darkening his uniform collar. "Sheriff Walker?" he asked. Walker nodded and signed the transfer papers without much thought. Procedure. That was all it was. Then the women stepped down. One by one. Quiet. Careful. Dust clung to their shoes and hems. Their gray dresses looked too heavy for Texas heat. Most kept their eyes down. Some looked scared. Some looked empty. Walker watched them with the distance of a lawman doing his job. Until he saw her. Elise Hartman stepped down last. She paused at the truck bed, steadying herself before touching the ground. Not weak. Not dramatic. Just tired. Her posture stayed straight, even under the weight of exhaustion. Walker noticed that first. The discipline. The stillness. She looked older than 26, not in years but in wear. Like life had already taken its share. He checked her file against her face. Blonde hair. Blue eyes. Former field nurse. Speaks English. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "Names will be called," he said flatly. "You answer and move inside." His voice carried across the yard. Cold. Professional. Elise understood immediately. When her name was called, she answered in clear English. "Present." The word landed strangely in the Texas heat. Cleaner than he expected. More educated. Walker looked up for half a second, surprised. She noticed. Said nothing. Inside the barn, the women were processed. Measurements. Work assignments. Housing placement. Standard routine. Walker stood near the back wall, arms crossed, observing. He told himself it was caution. But he kept watching Elise. Not because she stood out. Because she did not. She moved through everything with the kind of quiet control that made people pay attention without knowing why. No complaints. No questions. At one point Martha Green, the county clerk, handed Elise a canteen of water. Elise took it with both hands and said, "Thank you, ma'am." Martha blinked like she had not expected politeness from the enemy. Outside, a church bell rang once in the distance. Noon. The work foreman arrived to collect the prisoners for the cotton fields outside town. Walker watched as they climbed into the back of the farm truck. Before Elise stepped up, she stopped and looked across the yard at him. Just 1 second. No smile. No fear. Just a look that said she understood exactly what he saw when he looked at her. The enemy. Walker broke eye contact first. He told himself it meant nothing. Just another transfer. Another wartime duty. But as the truck pulled away in a cloud of red Texas dust, he kept watching long after it disappeared, and for reasons he could not explain, the name Elise Hartman stayed with him the rest of the day. The accident happened on the 4th morning. By sunrise the cotton fields outside Red Hollow already held heat like an iron skillet left on a stove. The rows stretched for acres, white blooms breaking against dry brown earth, endless under a pale blue sky. By 7 o'clock the prisoners were already working, moving slowly between the plants with canvas sacks over their shoulders. Sheriff Thomas Walker had ridden out that morning on routine inspection, nothing unusual, just making sure the county contracts with the Army stayed in order. That was what he told himself. But as his horse stepped through the gate, and the smell of dry soil and cotton rose into the air, he knew he had been thinking about one prisoner more than the paperwork required. Elise Hartman worked in the 3rd row from the fence line. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, her hands moving carefully through the cotton branches. She worked differently than the others. Precise. Methodical. Like every movement had purpose. Walker noticed it from 30 yards away. The field foreman, Ben Turner, spat tobacco into the dirt and shook his head. "They work harder than half the farmhands I ever had," he said. Walker said nothing. He scanned the rows, counting heads, checking the guards. Just routine. Then the shouting started. It came sharp from the far end of the field. A woman dropped her sack and ran. Another called out in German. Walker turned fast. Near the old barn, a small figure lay on the ground beside the wagon path. 8-year-old Samuel Turner, Ben's youngest boy, had fallen from the hay wagon while helping his father with water barrels. The boy was pale, his breathing shallow, his arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. Ben reached him first, panic all over his face. "Sammy," he said, dropping to his knees. "Sammy, talk to me." The boy did not answer. Walker moved fast, boots cutting through dust. Before he could kneel, Elise was already there. She had crossed half the field in seconds. One look at the boy and she dropped beside him, calm in a way that felt unnatural against everyone else's fear. "Do not move him," she said firmly, her English clean and direct. Ben looked at her, confused. "What? Do not move him," she repeated, already checking the boy's breathing, feeling his wrist, watching his eyes. Walker froze. It was the first time he had heard command in her voice. Not fear. Not obedience. Authority. Elise looked up at Walker. "His breathing is steady. He is in shock from the fall. He needs shade and cool water." Slowly. Walker nodded before realizing he was taking orders from a prisoner. Together they carried the boy into the barn, the inside 20 degrees cooler than the field. Dust floated through sunlight cutting between the wooden slats. Elise knelt beside Samuel, folded a clean cloth under his head, and spoke to him softly until his eyes opened. "Easy," she said. "Breathe slowly." The boy blinked, disoriented, but awake. Ben let out a breath like he had been holding it for a year. Walker stood against the barn wall, hat in hand, watching her. Watching the certainty in her hands. The steadiness. No hesitation. No performance. Just skill. Real skill. "You were a nurse," Walker said quietly. Elise did not look up. "Yes." "Army?" She paused. "Field hospitals." Ben stared at her, then at his son, then back again, like the war itself had shifted shape in front of him. Outside, the field had gone silent. The other women stood waiting in the heat, watching the barn doors. Walker looked at Elise differently now. Not because she had saved a child, but because for the first time since the war had put her in his town, he saw something that did not fit the word enemy. He saw discipline, mercy, and something harder to name. When Samuel finally sat up and asked for water, Ben wiped his face with trembling hands and looked at Elise. "Thank you," he said, the words awkward but honest. Elise only nodded, like gratitude was unnecessary. Walker stepped outside into the hot Texas sun, but the heat felt different now. Less certain. Like something invisible had shifted. And for the first time, Sheriff Thomas Walker understood that war could hand you a stranger and call them the enemy, but it could not force you to believe it. That evening the sun dropped slow behind the flat Texas horizon, stretching long shadows across Main Street and turning every window in red hollow gold. Sheriff Thomas Walker sat alone on the porch outside his office with a tin cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The town had settled into its usual rhythm. Screen doors slammed. Radios played low through open windows. Somewhere down the block a dog barked once and stopped. It was the kind of evening that usually cleared a man's head. Tonight it did not. He kept seeing Elise Hartmann in the barn. The way her hands moved without panic. The way her voice stayed steady when everyone else was afraid. He had seen doctors lose their nerve under pressure in France 25 years earlier. But not her. Not for 1 second. He took another drink of coffee. Cold now. Bitter. Across town, the prisoner barracks sat behind a low fence near the county grain storage. Temporary housing. Clean enough. Safe enough. Army regulations required lights out by 9, but at 8:30 Walker found himself riding past on horseback with no reason to stop. At least no reason he could explain. The lantern outside the gate flickered in the dry wind. One of the guards tipped his hat. "Evening, Sheriff." Walker nodded. "Everything quiet?" "Yes, sir." He should have kept riding. Instead, he dismounted and walked to the fence line. Inside the yard, several of the women sat on benches, sewing loose buttons or writing letters they might never send. Elise sat alone near the far end under the lantern light, a small notebook in her lap, pencil moving slow across the page. Walker stood there longer than necessary before speaking. "Riding home?" Elise looked up, surprised to see him. She closed the notebook halfway. "Trying to." Her voice was softer now than it had been in the barn. Less command. More tired. Walker leaned one arm against the fence rail. "Will it get there?" Elise looked down at the paper. "Maybe. Maybe not." The night air carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain that never seemed to arrive. For a moment neither of them said anything. Just the sound of crickets and the faint creak of the lantern hook in the wind. Walker cleared his throat. "Ben's boy is fine." Elise nodded once. "Good. Doctor says you kept him calm." That mattered. She looked at him then. Really looked at him. "It was my job once." Walker studied her face in the lantern light. Without the dust and heat of the field, she looked younger. But not untouched by life. There was something in her eyes he recognized. Loss. "How long were you a nurse?" he asked. 4 years. "Before the war?" She gave a small shake of her head. "During." Walker looked down at his boots. "War asks strange things of people?" Elise folded her notebook shut. "Yes." He noticed her hands then. Small scars across her knuckles. Not from labor. Older than that. The kind that come from work done under pressure. "Do you miss Germany?" he asked. She took her time answering. "I miss what Germany was before the war." That answer stayed between them like smoke. Walker understood it more than he expected. He thought of France in 1918. Boys who had looked just as scared as the men beside them. Uniforms changing nothing about fear. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said suddenly, surprising himself. Elise looked up, caught off guard by the honesty. "I am sorry." He nodded. "Sometimes this town gets too quiet after dark." Elise looked at the empty street beyond the fence. "Quiet can be heavy." Walker almost smiled. It was the truest thing he had heard all week. A bell rang from the church tower. 9 o'clock. Curfew. The guard stepped forward politely. "Time." Walker pushed off the fence and settled his hat back on his head. "Good night, Miss Hartmann." Elise held his eyes for half a second before answering. "Good night, Sheriff." He rode home under a sky full of stars, the coffee taste still bitter in his mouth, but something else had settled there too. Something quieter. Respect, maybe? Or the beginning of trust. And in a town where everybody noticed everything, 2 people had just spoken for 10 minutes by a fence, and by morning, someone would remember seeing it. The transfer order came on a Monday morning, folded in stiff army paper and stamped in blue ink. Sheriff Thomas Walker was halfway through his first cup of coffee when Corporal Jenkins stepped into his office and laid it on the desk without a word. Outside, the town was waking slow. Wagon wheels rolled over dirt roads. The bakery on Main Street pushed warm bread smell into the cool morning air. It should have felt like any other day. It did not. Walker opened the paper and read it once. Then again. Federal reassignment. Effective immediately. Prisoner labor unit to be divided and relocated to Camp Mason, 78 miles north. Administrative restructuring. He knew Camp Mason by reputation. Hard ground. Hard rules. No local oversight. A place run by men who believed discipline meant distance and mercy weakened order. He folded the paper carefully, but the edges bent under the pressure of his hands. By noon the news had reached the barracks. Prisoners always knew before officials announced it. Elise Hartmann stood outside near the wash line when Walker arrived. The wind pushed pale sheets against the wire fence, snapping softly like flags. She already knew. He could tell by the way she stood. Still. Prepared. When? She asked before he even spoke. Tomorrow morning. Her eyes shifted toward the dirt road, as if measuring the miles. Already? 78 miles might as well have been another country. Walker rested both hands on the fence rail. It is army business. They are splitting labor assignments. Elise gave one quiet nod. No protest. No anger. That was what unsettled him. Camp Mason, she said after a moment. I have heard of it. Walker studied her face. What have you heard? She looked at the ground. That it is colder there. Less human. The wind carried dust across the yard. Somewhere behind them, another prisoner folded blankets into a crate. The sound of wooden boxes closing felt final. Walker looked at the transfer papers in his hand. Official. Legal. Untouchable. And for the first time in years, paper felt heavier than law. You would be fine, he said, but even he did not believe it fully. Elise looked at him then, and there was no fear in her eyes. Just acceptance. People survive many things, Sheriff. That sentence landed hard. Because Walker knew she was right. Survival was not the same as living. He glanced at the notebook still tucked under her arm. Writing again? She nodded. Trying to remember things before they disappear. He understood that too well. Memories had their own kind of war. He stood there longer than he should have, hearing the morning sounds of town moving around them. A train whistle in the distance. The church bell striking 11. The ordinary world moving as if this moment did not matter. But it did. To him, it mattered more than it should have. That realization settled in his chest like a stone. He left the barracks and rode out to the Turner farm, where Samuel was back on his feet, chasing chickens through the yard like nothing had happened. Ben Turner met him at the gate. Heard they are shipping the girls out, Ben said. Walker nodded. Ben wiped his hands on his overalls. That nurse saved my boy. Walker stared at the field beyond the barn. White cotton moving in the breeze. I know. Ben studied him for a second. Funny thing about war. Makes strangers into enemies before they ever meet. Walker said nothing. That night the rain finally came, light at first, tapping against his porch roof like fingers. He sat in the dark with no lamp. Lit, listening to it. Thinking about a woman who had crossed an ocean in chains, healed a child that was not hers, and was now being sent away by men who had never seen her hands steady someone back to life. Around midnight Walker stood, pulled on his coat, and reached for his hat. Not because he had a plan. Not yet. But because for the first time since the war brought Elise Hartmann into Red Hollow, the thought of doing nothing felt worse than breaking the rules. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving Red Hollow washed clean and smelling of wet earth and cedar wood. Water dripped from porch roofs in slow, steady beats. Sheriff Thomas Walker had not slept. The transfer order sat folded on his kitchen table beside an untouched cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. He had spent the night staring at that paper, turning one question over and over in his mind. What happens when the law is right, but justice feels wrong? By 6:30 he was walking toward the prisoner barracks, boots darkened by wet dirt, hat low against the morning chill. The guards looked surprised to see him so early. One nodded and stepped aside. Inside the yard, the women were packing what little they had. Blankets folded. Tin cups stacked. Letters tied with string. Army trucks would arrive by noon. Elise Hartmann stood near the fence with her notebook in hand, the same small book she always carried. She looked up when she saw him. There was no surprise in her face. Almost like she had expected him. Walker stopped a few feet away. For a moment neither spoke. The morning felt suspended, quiet except for birds in the wet cottonwoods overhead. Finally Walker reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded transfer order. He held it in both hands, then tore it once down the middle. Then again. Elise watched without speaking. The pieces dropped into the mud between them. "That does not change anything," she said softly. Walker looked at her. "No," he said. "It does not." He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, something she had never seen him do. A small sign of a man unsettled. "I spent all night trying to find another way." Elise held the notebook tighter against her chest. "And?" Walker looked at her for a long moment. The truth was simple now. Too simple. He stepped closer to the fence. "There is one." Her eyes narrowed slightly, trying to understand him before he spoke it. Walker reached into his coat again and placed a small silver ring on the top rail between them. Rainwater still clung to it, catching the pale morning light. Elise stared at it like it did not belong in the world they were standing in. "If you become my wife," he said quietly, "they cannot transfer you as prisoner labor. Your legal status changes. It forces review." The words hung there, plain and sharp. No softness. No poetry. Just truth. Elise looked at him, stunned not by the offer, but by how steady he sounded saying it. "Marriage?" she asked. Walker nodded once. "Today." She looked down at the ring again. "Sheriff, this is not a small thing." "I know. People will talk." Walker almost smiled. "People in this town talk when the weather changes." That brought the smallest breath of laughter from her, gone almost as fast as it came. Then silence returned. Elise turned toward the wet yard, the packed bags, the waiting road beyond the fence. Everything temporary. Everything uncertain. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this?" Walker answered without hesitation. "Because what happens to you next matters to me." It was the most honest sentence he had spoken in years. Elise looked at him carefully, measuring the weight of it. Not romance. Not rescue. Something quieter. Something stronger. Respect. Choice. Human dignity. She opened her notebook, tore out one page, and folded it into her palm. A letter she had been writing to a home that no longer existed. Then she slipped the notebook closed. "If I say yes," she said, "your life changes too." Walker looked at the broken transfer papers in the mud. "It already has." The church bell rang 7 times across town, each note clear in the cold morning air. Elise looked at the silver ring one last time, then at the man standing on the other side of the fence, offering her something no army order could ever command. A choice. And for the first time since arriving in Texas, Elise Hartman understood that freedom did not always arrive as open gates. Sometimes it arrived as one impossible question asked in the rain. Elise did not answer right away. The morning stretched around them, cool and damp after the rain, the ground still dark with moisture, the fence rails slick beneath Walker's hand. Somewhere beyond the barracks, a truck engine started and then died again, a mechanic fighting with the cold. The ordinary sounds of town waking up felt far away now. Elise looked at the silver ring resting on the rail between them. Plain. Unpolished. Honest. Not the kind of ring a woman imagined wearing. But then, nothing about her life had followed imagination. She lifted her eyes to Walker. "Do you understand what they will think?" Walker nodded. "Yes. They will say you betrayed your country." He looked at her steadily. "Let them talk." Elise studied him for another long second, searching for uncertainty. There was none. Only the quiet resolve of a man who had already stepped across the line in his own mind. Finally, she reached out and picked up the ring. Her fingers were cold from the morning air. "Then yes," she said. The word was barely above a whisper, but it changed the shape of everything around them. By 8 o'clock they were standing in Reverend Samuel Price's office behind the church on Willow Street. The room smelled of old books, candle wax, and pine wood floors worn smooth by decades of Sunday shoes. Martha Green had been pulled from the county records office to witness the paperwork, her face pale with disbelief. She kept adjusting her glasses like clearer vision might explain what was happening. Reverend Price stood with both hands on the Bible, looking from Walker to Elise and back again. Thomas, he said quietly, I need to ask you one final time. Is this your free decision? Walker answered without hesitation. It is. The Reverend turned to Elise. And yours? Elise stood straight, hands folded in front of her borrowed blue dress, one Martha had found in the church basement after hearing the story. It fit her imperfectly, sleeves a little short, waist a little loose, but it was clean and carried the smell of lavender soap. Elise nodded. Yes. Outside, rainwater dripped from the church roof into puddles below. Inside, the world narrowed to 4 people and a promise no one had expected to witness. Walker placed the ring on her finger. It fit loosely. Elise looked down at it, almost like it belonged to someone else. Reverend Price spoke the final words, simple and steady. No music. No flowers. No family. Just vows carried by quiet voices in an empty room. When it was done, Martha signed the marriage certificate with shaking hands. Lord help us, she murmured under her breath. Walker folded the paper and placed it inside his coat pocket. Legal now. Real. Outside the church, the morning had brightened. Sunlight broke through the last of the clouds, warming the wet street. Elise stood beside him on the church steps, the town still unaware that everything had changed in the last 20 minutes. What happens now? She asked. Walker looked down Main Street, where shopkeepers were opening doors and sweeping sidewalks, unaware of the storm already moving toward them. No, he said. We tell the army. As if the words had summoned it, the sound of an engine rolled through town. Not a farm truck. Not local. Sharp. Official. A dark army sedan turned the corner and stopped in front of the courthouse, tires hissing against wet dirt. 2 men stepped out in press uniforms, hats low, briefcases in hand. Army intelligence. Walker recognized the insignia immediately. They moved with the clean precision of men who carried authority like a weapon, even without raising their voices. One of them looked toward the church steps and paused. His eyes moved from Walker to Elise, then to the ring on her hand. His face did not change, but something in his posture did. Recognition. Calculation. The taller officer adjusted his gloves and started walking toward them. Slow. Certain. And for the first time that morning, Elise felt the weight of the silver ring not as protection but as proof. Whatever came next would not be private. It would be measured, questioned, and judged. And as the polished shoes of Army intelligence tapped against the wet wooden sidewalk, Sheriff Thomas Walker understood that marriage had been the easy part. The cost of it was just arriving. The questioning began in the courthouse at 10:15 that morning. By then the whole town knew. News moved through Red Hollow faster than rainwater through dry dirt. Shop doors stayed open but nobody worked. Men stood outside the barber shop. Women whispered at the bakery window. By the time Sheriff Thomas Walker and Elise Walker stepped through the courthouse doors, half the town had already decided what the story meant. Inside, the main hearing room smelled of old wood, paper, and dust warmed by sunlight. 2 Army intelligence officers sat at the long table near the front, their jackets neat, their notebooks open, their faces unreadable. Major Daniel Reeves was older, maybe 50, with gray at his temples and eyes that missed nothing. Beside him sat Captain Henry Collins, younger, sharper, the kind of man who trusted regulations more than instinct. Walker stood before them without his hat, hands at his sides, shoulders square. Elise sat behind him in the front bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the silver ring catching light whenever she moved. Major Reeves opened the file slowly. Sheriff Walker, he said, voice calm. Did you knowingly marry a prisoner of war under federal custody? Walker answered plainly. Yes. Captain Collins wrote something down. Without prior federal authorization? Yes. Collins looked up. Do you understand that could be interpreted as interference with wartime administration? Walker held his ground. I understand what it looks like. Reeves leaned back in his chair. Then explain what it is. The room went quiet. Walker looked through the courthouse window for a moment, out at Main Street where dust moved in little circles under the noon sun. Then he answered. It is what happens when paperwork forgets there is a human being attached to it. Collins frowned. She was a prisoner. Walker turned back. She is a nurse. She saved a child in this town. She followed every order given to her. She worked. She obeyed. And your transfer order was sending her somewhere nobody in this county would trust for decent treatment. Collins tapped his pencil. That was not your decision to make. No, Walker said. But this was. Reeves looked past Walker toward Elise. Mrs. Walker, he said, the title sounding strange even to him. Stand, please. Elise stood slowly, smoothing the borrowed blue dress with her hands. Reeves studied her. Did Sheriff Walker pressure you into this marriage? Elise answered clearly. No, did he offer protection in exchange for marriage? She shook her head once. He offered a choice. Collins leaned forward. Do you claim affection for this man? Elise paused. Not because she did not know. Because the truth deserved precision. I claim respect, she said. And trust. That answer settled heavily in the room. Not sentimental. Not dramatic. Real. Before Collins could ask another question, the courtroom doors opened and Ben Turner stepped inside, hat in hand, his son Samuel beside him. Behind them came Martha Green. Then Reverend Price. Then 3 shopkeepers. Then 2 farmhands. One by one, townspeople filled the benches. No one had been called. They had simply come. Ben stepped forward first. My boy is alive because of her, he said. Samuel stood beside him, clutching his cap, looking healthier than he had a week ago. Martha Green adjusted her glasses and spoke next. I witnessed that marriage. It was honest. Reverend Price nodded. Lawful under county record. More voices followed. Quiet. Steady. Not defending romance. Defending character. Major Reeves watched all of it without writing a word. He looked at Elise. Then Walker. Then at the room full of ordinary Texans standing for a woman who had arrived as the enemy and somehow become part of their town. Captain Collins closed his notebook, unsettled by the simplicity of it. Reeves finally stood and closed the file. This matter will be reviewed by Washington, he said. Until then, Mrs. Walker remains here under temporary civilian marital status. Temporary. It was not freedom. Not yet. But it was enough for now. As the officers walked out into the bright Texas afternoon, Walker sat beside Elise on the wooden bench for the first time all day. Neither spoke. The courtroom slowly emptied around them. Dust floated in the sunlight. The sound of boots faded. And for the first time since the impossible morning at the church, both of them understood something important. The truth had been spoken. Now they would have to live with whatever it cost. Washington answered 12 days later. The telegram arrived just after sunrise, folded into a yellow envelope and handed to Sheriff Thomas Walker by the same mailman who had delivered county taxes and war notices for 20 years. The paper felt lighter than Walker expected, but his hands felt heavier holding it. He stood on the porch of his house, coffee steaming in the cold October air, and read every word twice. Federal review complete. Marriage recognized under civilian jurisdiction. Prisoner of war classification suspended pending post-war immigration review. No criminal charges recommended. The language was dry. Official. But it meant one thing. Elise would stay. Walker folded the telegram and slipped it into his coat pocket, then looked across the porch where Elise sat in the morning light, a cup of coffee warming her hands. For the first time since arriving in Texas, she was wearing clothes that belonged to her now. A plain cream blouse. A brown skirt Martha Green had altered to fit. No prison gray. No number sewn into fabric. Just cloth. Just life. Walker stepped toward her and handed over the telegram. Elise read it slowly, carefully, her lips moving with each line. When she finished, she stared at the paper for a long moment, like freedom looked too much like paper to trust at first. So that is it? she asked quietly. Walker sat beside her in the porch chair, wood creaking under his weight. For now. Elise looked out at the road. The cotton fields beyond town were almost ready for harvest, white and endless under the pale autumn sky. In Germany, she said softly. Papers decided everything too. Walker nodded. Here too. That made her smile, small but real. Life in Red Hollow changed slowly after that, the way most real changes do. Not with celebration. With routine. Elise began helping at the town clinic 3 mornings a week, assisting Dr. Warren with bandages, fevers, births, and the endless ordinary troubles of farm life. At first people came in careful, watching her, measuring the accent in her voice and the history in her name. But skill had its own language. Within weeks mothers were asking for her by name. Children stopped staring. Old men stopped whispering. She became part of the town not because people forgot where she came from, but because they learned who she was. Walker stayed sheriff. Same badge. Same desk. Same long hours. But people looked at him differently now. Some with respect. Some with doubt. He accepted both. Every choice had a price. He had simply decided which price he could live with. Winter came early that year. Cold winds swept over the Texas plains and pushed dry leaves across Main Street. One evening in December, Walker and Elise stood outside the church after Sunday service, watching children run through the yard with red cheeks and wool hats. Samuel Turner ran past and waved at Elise before disappearing into the crowd. She watched him go, then looked at Walker. Do you ever regret it? Walker adjusted his gloves against the cold. Marrying you? Elise nodded once. Walker looked at the church doors, the warm yellow light spilling onto the frozen ground. Then at the town around them. The same town that had once watched her arrive as the enemy. The same town that now saved her a seat at supper and asked about her day. No, he said simply. Elise slipped her hand into his coat pocket to warm it, her fingers brushing the folded telegram still kept there like proof of a moment that could have gone another way. The war would end months later. Europe would rebuild. Borders would change. Flags would rise and fall. But in Red Hollow, people remembered something smaller and stronger than war. They remembered the day a sheriff looked past a uniform and saw a human being. And years later, when strangers asked how a German woman came to live in a Texas town and work at the clinic beside a sheriff who once guarded her, the people of Red Hollow always answered the same way. Quietly. Like truth did not need decoration. They would say the war brought her here. But dignity made her stay. Because in the end, she did not raise her voice. She raised the standard.